Delta Force marked the grizzled veteran's tattoo until the general rolled up his sleeve. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Bragg's training compound as Sergeant Jack Morrison adjusted his worn fatigues. At 52, he was easily the oldest man in Delta Force's new joint training exercise. His weathered hands bore the scars of 3 decades in the Army, and his graying beard couldn't hide the lines etched deep by countless missions in places the public would never hear about. The younger operators eyed him with barely concealed skepticism. Morrison had been transferred from a regular infantry unit just weeks ago, an unusual move that had everyone talking. His service record was solid but unremarkable, multiple deployments, steady promotions, nothing spectacular. To the elite Delta operators, he looked like dead weight. "Check out Grandpa's ink," whispered Staff Sergeant Tyler Chen, nodding toward Morrison's left forearm. A faded tattoo was barely visible beneath his sleeve, some kind of military insignia so old and worn it was nearly illegible. The younger soldiers snickered as they passed, their own crisp tattoos and fresh scars marking them as the military's finest. Before continuing, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to discover more stories of heroes whose true value isn't written in their personnel files. Captain Rodriguez called the formation to attention. The day's exercise would simulate a hostage rescue in an urban environment, Delta Force's bread and butter. Morrison fell into line with Alpha Team, drawing more sideways glances from his teammates. Corporal Jake Williams, barely 25 with arms covered in fresh tattoos documenting his short but intense career, made no effort to hide his disdain. "Hope you can keep up, old-timer," Williams muttered during equipment check. "This isn't some weekend warrior drill." Morrison said nothing, methodically checking his gear with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. His rifle was clean but older model, his boots worn but well-maintained. Everything about him screamed ordinary soldier, the kind who filled out formations but never made headlines. The briefing room buzzed with the confident energy of men who knew they were the best. Colonel Matthews outlined the scenario. Terrorists had taken hostages in a mock Middle Eastern village built for training. Intelligence suggested 12 hostiles, unknown number of civilians, time-sensitive extraction required. "Alpha Team takes point," Matthews announced. "Bravo provides overwatch, Charlie handles extraction. Questions?" Morrison raised his hand slowly. "Sir, the intel mentions a specific building layout. Has anyone considered the possibility of false walls or hidden passages common in that architectural style?" The room fell silent. Williams rolled his eyes. "Here we go, Professor." Colonel Matthews paused, studying Morrison's personnel file on his tablet. "Elaborate, Sergeant." "Traditional construction in that region often includes concealed rooms for storage or protection. If the hostiles are local, they'd know about them. Could affect our breach points and extraction routes." Several operators exchanged glances. It was a valid tactical consideration, but coming from the outsider, it felt like showing off. "Noted," Matthews said curtly. "Anything else?" Morrison shook his head and settled back into his chair. Around him, the Delta operators continued their mission planning, but now there was an undercurrent of curiosity mixed with their skepticism. Who was this regular Army sergeant who spoke like he'd actually been in these situations before? As they geared up for the exercise, Morrison caught Williams staring at his faded tattoo again. The younger soldier's expression had shifted from mockery to puzzlement. There was something familiar about that insignia, something that nagged at the edges of his military knowledge. The morning air was crisp as Alpha Team moved toward the training village. Morrison took his assigned position at the rear of the formation, the place typically reserved for the least experienced or trusted member. But as they approached the target building, his eyes were constantly scanning, noting details others missed. The angle of shadows that could hide a sniper, the placement of windows that suggested interior layout, the wear patterns on doorways that indicated primary and secondary entrances. The training village erupted into chaos as the exercise began. Alpha Team moved with the precision expected of Delta Force, but within minutes, it became clear that the scenario designers had thrown them several curveballs. The terrorists were using tactics that caught even these elite soldiers off guard. Williams kicked in what should have been the primary entrance, only to find it led to a dead-end corridor. "What the hell?" he muttered into his calm. The intelligence had been wrong or incomplete. "Alpha Leader, we're boxed in," Rodriguez reported. "Building layout doesn't match the brief." From his position at the rear, Morrison keyed his radio. "Alpha Leader, permission to suggest alternative entry." There was a pause. Rodriguez's voice crackled back, tense with frustration. "Go ahead, Morrison." "Northeast corner, second floor. There should be a small balcony access. Traditional design would place it near the main living area, where hostages would likely be held." Williams shot him a look. "How could you possibly know that?" Morrison was already moving, his aged legs carrying him with surprising speed around the building's perimeter. "Because I've been in houses like this before." The team followed, their skepticism warring with desperation as the exercise timer ticked down. Morrison pointed to a partially concealed external staircase, weathered and designed to look authentically Middle Eastern. "There, that'll put us above the main room." "That wasn't in the intel package," Chen protested. "Exactly," Morrison replied, already starting up the stairs. "That's why it'll work." Alpha Team found themselves following the old sergeant's lead as he navigated the building's layout with an intuition that defied explanation. He seemed to know where each room connected, which walls were load-bearing, and which passages would provide the best tactical advantage. The hostage rescue proceeded flawlessly from there. Morrison's knowledge of the architecture allowed the team to surprise the terrorists from an unexpected angle, neutralize the threats, and extract the civilians with minimal complications. As they emerged from the building, the exercise observers were checking their stopwatches with impressed expressions. Back at the debriefing, Colonel Matthews studied the after-action report with raised eyebrows. "That was textbook execution once you found your rhythm." "Morrison, where did that architectural knowledge come from?" "Experience, sir," Morrison replied simply. Williams couldn't let it go. "Experience where?" "Your file shows standard infantry deployments. When did you become an expert on Middle Eastern building construction?" Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been around, Corporal." The younger soldier's frustration was palpable. "Look, Grandpa, we're all professionals here. If you've got relevant experience, we need to know about it. This isn't some pissing contest." "Williams," Rodriguez warned, but the corporal was on a roll. "I mean seriously, what's with the Mystery Man Act? And that tattoo of yours, what unit is that even from? It's so faded I can't make out the details." Morrison stood slowly, his weathered face unreadable. For a moment the room held its breath, sensing an undercurrent of tension that went beyond typical military hierarchy. "Some tattoos fade," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made even Williams pause. "Doesn't mean what they represent loses its meaning." He gathered his gear and headed for the door, leaving behind a room full of confused Delta operators. As he passed Williams, the younger soldier caught another glimpse of that mysterious tattoo. There was something about the barely visible insignia that tugged at his memory, something important he couldn't quite place. "He's hiding something," Williams muttered to Chen as Morrison disappeared down the corridor. Chen nodded, but his expression was thoughtful rather than suspicious. "Question is, what and why?" Outside, Morrison walked across the compound with measured steps, aware of the eyes following him from the briefing room windows. He'd known this day would come eventually, when his past and present would collide in ways that couldn't be easily explained away. The young soldiers wanted answers he wasn't ready to give, about missions that officially never happened, and a unit that didn't exist in any public records. His fingers unconsciously traced the faded tattoo beneath his sleeve. 30 years ago, it had been crisp and clear, the mark of an elite unit so classified that even its existence was compartmentalized. Now it was just another mystery to the generation of warriors who'd inherited the fight he'd started. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions. But tonight, Jack Morrison would carry his secrets a little longer, protecting not just classified information, but the memories of brothers who died in places that didn't appear on any map. The mess hall buzzed with the usual evening chatter, but at Alpha Team's table, conversation had taken on a more serious tone. Williams pushed his food around his plate, his mind still wrestling with the day's events. "I'm telling you guys, something doesn't add up," he said, keeping his voice low. "Regular infantry sergeants don't just magically know classified building layouts and tactical approaches we've never seen before." Chen glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Maybe he's just experienced. 30 years is a long time." "That's exactly my point," Williams insisted. 30 years, multiple deployments, and his record is completely vanilla. No special operations, no advanced training courses, no commendations beyond the standard stuff. Come on. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, the team's communications specialist, leaned forward. "What if his real records are classified above our pay grade?" The table fell silent. In the special operations community, they all knew that certain missions and units existed in the shadows, their members' true service records buried under layers of classification that might never see daylight. "You think he's former unit?" Williams asked, referring to Delta Force's official designation. "Or something else entirely," Santos replied. "That tattoo, I've been thinking about it all day. The design looked familiar, but I can't place it." Across the mess hall, Morrison sat alone, methodically eating his dinner while reading a worn paperback novel. He seemed completely unaware of the scrutiny, but Williams caught him glancing up occasionally, his eyes scanning the room with the automatic vigilance of someone who'd spent too many years in dangerous places. "I'm going to ask him directly," Williams announced, starting to stand. "Bad idea," Rodriguez's voice cut across the table as the captain approached with his tray. "Sit down, Corporal." Williams reluctantly complied, as Rodriguez took the empty seat beside him. The captain's expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there that morning. "I made some calls after the debrief," Rodriguez said quietly. "Reached out to some contacts about our new team member." The others leaned in closer. "And," Santos prompted, "and I was told very politely to stop asking questions." Rodriguez took a bite of his food, letting that sink in. The kind of stop asking that comes with implied consequences for one's career. Williams felt a chill run down his spine. Jesus, what did we stumble into? The kind of situation where smart soldiers mind their own business and focus on their missions, Rodriguez replied firmly. "Morrison's here, he's on our team, and he knows his job. That's all we need to know." But even as Rodriguez spoke the words, Williams could see the curiosity burning in the captain's eyes. They were all thinking the same thing. What kind of soldier inspired phone calls that shut down inquiries before they even began? Later that evening, Williams found himself in the base gym, working off his frustration on the heavy bag. The facility was nearly empty, just a few night shift personnel getting in late workouts. He was surprised when Morrison appeared at the adjacent bag, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd been fighting longer than Williams had been alive. They worked in silence for several minutes, the rhythm of fists against leather creating an oddly companionable soundtrack. Finally, Williams couldn't contain himself any longer. "Look, Sergeant, I owe you an apology. The cracks about your age, the attitude, that was unprofessional." Morrison paused his workout, unwrapping his hands with practiced efficiency. "You're a good soldier, Williams, young but good. Your instincts are sharp, and you care about your team. Nothing wrong with being cautious about unknowns. But I was wrong to be disrespectful." Morrison's smile was surprisingly warm. "Son, I've been disrespected by experts. A few comments from a corporal don't even register." Williams hesitated, then decided to take the plunge. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask, doesn't mean I'll answer." "That tattoo on your arm, I know I've seen that design before. It's driving me crazy that I can't place it. Morrison finished packing his gear, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Some symbols carry weight beyond their appearance, corporal. Sometimes it's better not to know their full meaning. Why? What could be so? Because, Morrison interrupted gently, once you know certain things, you can't unknow them. And some knowledge comes with responsibilities you might not be ready to carry. He shouldered his gym bag and headed toward the exit, then paused at the doorway. But I will say this, that faded ink represents some of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve with. Men who gave everything for missions the world will never hear about. Williams watched him go, more confused than ever. As he gathered his own equipment, he noticed something Morrison had left behind, a small piece of paper that had fallen from his gym bag. Williams picked it up, expecting to find a phone number or appointment reminder. Instead, he found himself staring at a photograph, worn and creased with age. It showed a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, their faces young and intense. The image quality suggested it was taken decades ago, but what caught Williams's attention was the barely visible patch on one soldier's sleeve, a design that matched the faded tattoo he'd been trying to identify. But it was the face in the center of the group that made his blood run cold. Even 30 years younger, scarred by time and hardship, it was unmistakably Morrison. And beside him in the photo stood a figure Williams recognized from military history books and classified briefings, a man whose very presence suggested operations that existed in the deepest shadows of American military history. Williams stared at the photograph for a long moment, his mind racing with implications. Then, very carefully, he placed it back where Morrison had dropped it and walked away, understanding for the first time why some questions were better left unasked. The call came at 300 hours, jarring Alpha Team from sleep with the harsh urgency that meant real-world deployment. Not an exercise, the genuine article. Williams rolled out of his bunk, muscle memory taking over as he grabbed his gear. Around him, the barracks erupted into controlled chaos as Delta operators prepared for immediate departure. Brief in 10 minutes, Rodriguez's voice cut through the noise. Full battle rattle, no questions asked. The briefing room felt different at 3 in the morning, shadows sharper under the fluorescent lights. Colonel Matthews stood before a map of Eastern Europe, his expression grim. Beside him, a figure Williams didn't recognize, a civilian in an expensive suit, whose presence suggested high-level intelligence involvement. Gentlemen, we have a situation, Matthews began without preamble. Approximately 6 hours ago, a diplomatic convoy was ambushed in a contested region. 3 American officials are missing, presumed captured by a well-organized terrorist cell. The suited man stepped forward. I'm Deputy Director Harrison, CIA. The individuals taken include a State Department negotiator working on sensitive peace talks and 2 intelligence officers whose capture would compromise ongoing operations throughout the region. Williams felt the familiar pre-mission adrenaline surge, but something about this briefing felt different. More urgent, more personal somehow. The terrorist cell is well-funded and extremely sophisticated, Harrison continued. They've taken the hostages to a compound that our intelligence suggests is heavily fortified and designed specifically to prevent rescue attempts. Matthews activated a laser pointer, highlighting a satellite image on the screen. The facility is built into a natural cave system, with multiple entry points and unknown interior passages. Traditional assault approaches have been analyzed and deemed unfeasible given the terrain and defensive positions. Williams glanced around the room, noting the tension in his teammates' faces. This was exactly the kind of mission Delta Force existed to handle, but even they had limits. Sir, Rodriguez spoke up, with respect, if traditional approaches won't work, what's the alternative? Harrison and Matthews exchanged a look that Williams couldn't interpret. That's where Sergeant Morrison comes in, Matthews said quietly. All eyes turned to Morrison, who sat at the back of the room with the same calm demeanor he'd shown during training exercises. But now, in the harsh light of a real-world crisis, That calmness seemed less like indifference and more like the steady confidence of someone who'd been in situations like this before. Morrison has specific experience with this type of facility, Harrison explained. 23 years ago, he was part of a classified operation that targeted a similar compound in the same general region. Williams felt his world shift. The pieces he'd been trying to fit together suddenly snapped into focus with crystalline clarity. The mission was successful but came at significant cost, Harrison continued. Most of the operational details remain classified, but Sergeant Morrison's knowledge of these cave systems and their defensive characteristics makes him invaluable to this rescue operation. Morrison stood slowly, his weathered face betraying no emotion. The compound you're showing us, it's not just similar to the one we hit in 2001. It's the same facility, rebuilt and reinforced. The room fell silent. Williams could hear his own heartbeat in the stillness. "You've been there before?" Chen asked quietly. "I helped design the original assault plan," Morrison replied. "My team spent 3 weeks studying that cave system, mapping every passage, identifying every potential ambush point and extraction route." Harrison nodded grimly. "The terrorist cell has chosen this location specifically because they believe it's impregnable. They don't know that we have someone who's been inside before." Williams's mind raced back to the photograph he'd found, the faces of young soldiers whose mission had been erased from official history. The operation in 2001, how many came back? Morrison's eyes met his across the room, and Williams saw a depth of pain that explained everything about the older soldier's quiet demeanor. 3, Morrison said simply. "Out of 12. The weight of that revelation settled over the briefing room like a shroud. These elite Delta operators, men who prided themselves on being the military's finest, suddenly understood that they were sitting with someone who'd paid prices they couldn't imagine. "The mission parameters are non-negotiable," Matthews said, his voice cutting through the emotional tension. "We extract all 3 hostages alive, and we do it before the terrorist deadline expires in 18 hours. Morrison stepped forward, moving to the front of the room with quiet authority. "If we're going back into that facility, you need to understand what we're facing. The cave system has been their stronghold for decades because it's a natural fortress. But every fortress has weaknesses if you know where to look." As Morrison began outlining the tactical approach, using knowledge purchased with the blood of brothers lost decades ago, Williams finally understood the meaning of the faded tattoo. It wasn't just a unit insignia, it was a memorial to soldiers who died in places that didn't exist, for missions that were never officially acknowledged. And now, 23 years later, their sacrifice might be the key to bringing 3 Americans home alive. The briefing room had transformed into something resembling a chapel, with Morrison speaking like a priest, recounting a sacred text written in the language of tactics and loss. The compound looked exactly as Morrison remembered it, a jagged wound in the mountainside where natural caves had been reinforced with concrete and steel. As Alpha Team crept through the pre-dawn darkness, Morrison felt the ghosts of his fallen teammates moving beside him, their memories providing guidance through terrain that had claimed their lives decades ago. "Entry point Alpha is here," he whispered into his comm, indicating a seemingly innocent rock formation. "Natural chimney leads directly to the main chamber. They won't expect us to come from above." Williams followed Morrison's lead without question now, his earlier skepticism replaced by profound respect. The old sergeant moved through the darkness like he was navigating his own backyard, avoiding defensive positions with an intimacy that spoke of hard-won experience. The insertion went flawlessly. Morrison's knowledge of the cave system proved invaluable as Alpha Team bypassed 3 separate ambush points, moving through passages that didn't appear on any intelligence report. His understanding of the facility's layout was so complete that Williams began to suspect the 2001 mission had involved more than just a brief reconnaissance. "Contact front," Rodriguez whispered as they approached the main chamber. Through night vision scopes, They could see the three hostages bound in the center of a natural amphitheater, surrounded by heavily armed guards. Morrison studied the scene with tactical eyes that had seen variations of this nightmare before. 12 hostiles visible, probably 4 more in overwatch positions, he murmured. Standard defensive deployment for this type of facility. How can you be sure about the overwatch? Santos asked. Because that's exactly how we would have set it up, Morrison replied. And 23 years ago, that's exactly how they killed half my team. The assault was poetry in motion. Morrison's knowledge of sight lines and defensive positions allowed Alpha Team to neutralize the terrorist guards with surgical precision. Within 4 minutes, the hostages were secured and the immediate threat eliminated. But as they prepared for extraction, Morrison's expression darkened. We need to move. Now, they'll have a contingency plan. His warning proved prophetic as the cave system began filling with smoke. The terrorists' final gambit to deny the Americans their victory. But Morrison had anticipated even this, leading the team through a secondary passage he'd mapped during that long-ago mission. As they emerged into daylight with all 3 hostages alive, Williams found himself walking beside Morrison during the extraction march. The older sergeant's face was etched with emotions that went beyond professional satisfaction. The men you lost in 2001, Williams said quietly, they made this possible today. Morrison nodded, his fingers unconsciously tracing the faded tattoo beneath his sleeve. They knew the risks, we all did, but they also knew that someday someone might need to go back. 2 hours later, back at the forward operating base, Williams watched Morrison sit alone outside the debriefing tent, staring at the mountains where his brothers had died. The mission had been a complete success, 3 Americans rescued, terrorist cell eliminated, no friendly casualties. By any measure, it was a textbook operation. But Williams understood now that for Morrison, success was measured differently. Every mission carried the weight of those who hadn't come home, every victory shadowed by losses that couldn't be quantified in official reports. Colonel Matthews emerged from the command tent, his expression mixing relief with something approaching awe. Outstanding work, Sergeant. Your knowledge of that facility saved American lives today. Morrison stood and saluted with the precise bearing of 3 decades in uniform. Just doing my job, sir. No, Matthews replied, returning the salute with unusual formality. You were honoring your fallen teammates. There's a difference. As the colonel walked away, Williams approached Morrison with newfound understanding. The transfer to Delta Force, it wasn't random, was it? Someone knew you might be needed for something like this. Morrison's smile was tired but genuine. In this business, Corporal, the past has a way of becoming relevant when you least expect it. The question is whether you're ready when that moment comes. The tattoo, Williams said. What unit was it really? Morrison looked at the younger soldier for a long moment, then slowly rolled up his sleeve. In the afternoon light, the faded insignia was clearer than Williams had ever seen it, not a standard military unit patch, but something far more exclusive. A symbol representing soldiers who operated beyond the reach of conventional recognition. Task Force Black, Morrison said quietly. We were the prototype for units like Delta Force, back when the Pentagon was still figuring out how to fight the kind of wars that don't appear in history books. Williams stared at the tattoo with new understanding. Task Force Black was legendary in special operations circles, a unit so classified that even its existence was debated among intelligence professionals. How many of you were there? Williams asked. Officially. We never existed. Morrison rolled his sleeve back down. Unofficially, enough to get the job done until we didn't exist anymore. That evening, as Alpha Team prepared for transport home, Williams found Morrison packing his gear with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. The younger soldier had been thinking all day about respect, sacrifice, and the weight of secrets carried by ordinary-looking men. Sergeant, Williams said, I want you to know that faded tattoo saved more lives than all our medals combined. Morrison paused in his packing, looking at Williams with something approaching paternal pride. Son, the tattoo didn't save anyone. The men it represents did that 23 years ago when they mapped every inch of those caves knowing they might not come home. He shouldered his pack and headed toward the transport, then paused at the tent entrance. Remember that, Corporal. Heroes don't always wear fresh ink and shiny medals. Sometimes they're just old soldiers carrying invisible scars and faded memories, waiting for the day when what they learned in hell might help someone else make it home. As Morrison disappeared into the transport, Williams understood that he'd been privileged to serve alongside living history, a reminder that the most valuable warriors aren't always the ones who look the part, but those who have paid prices that can't be displayed on a uniform. The faded tattoo was more than military insignia. It was a memorial to brothers who died so that someday 3 American lives might be saved by knowledge purchased with their sacrifice. In the end, that was what true heroism looked like, not glory or recognition, but the quiet carrying of burdens that allowed others to come home.